All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Baltimore City Historical Society's Baltimore History Evening. We're really excited to have you with us here this evening, and we're especially excited about our talk with Dr. Kate Drabinski, which I will get to in just a moment. But just to get some things out of the way, we'd love to thank our current membership with the Baltimore City Historical Society, our fellow board members, and our sponsors, including Trace Architects, University of Baltimore, as well as the Inheritance Baltimore and Billie Holiday Liberation Projects. Thank you for your support. And we'll remind you as well that we are an all-volunteer operation, and we certainly appreciate support that you can provide through membership and donation. So check that out through our website, which we'll drop in the chat in just a minute. I'll also remind you again that this talk is being recorded. We do welcome comments and questions in the chat, but we'll also say that we will save those for the end for any questions that we may run by our speaker. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce, we have Dr. Kate Drabinski with us here this evening. She is a principal lecturer in gender, women's, and sexuality studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Her most recent publication is Baltimore Revisited, co-edited with Nicole King and Josh Davis. She's on the board of Baltimore Heritage, leads walking tours of LGBTQ+ and other histories in the city. She's currently working with students on the UMBC LGBTQ+ Oral History Project, now entering its third year. And in her free time, she rides her bike all over town, thinking about how neighborhoods come to look the way they do and how they might look differently. And we're really gifted here to hear Dr. Drabinski's talk about doing queer history in public. So thank you so much, Dr. Drabinski, for taking your time and joining us here this evening. Really excited to learn. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody's name on a box in a screen. I'm Kate Drabinski, as you just heard, and I'm excited to talk a bit about how I think about doing queer history in public. And I'm going to share my screen. And I'm not even going to ask you if you can see it, because I know you can, because this is not my first rodeo. All right, so this is beautiful, right? I never made slides, and then we had to teach online, and so now I make slides. So here we are. So tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and how I got involved and interested in history. And then I'm going to talk about the four bits of this talk. Doing, why I think that's so important to how we think about history. Queer, because that's the kind of history that I'm interested in, and honestly has helped me think in complex ways about everything in the world. History, how I think about it, and then what in public means for me. And then I have sort of three examples of things that I've worked on that I'll talk about as I sort of attempt to share histories, to gather histories, to be part of making queer history, especially when so much of our histories are, and I'm a lesbian, so I'm in this community. So many of our histories has been hidden, and for good reasons and also for terrible ones. So that's what we're doing tonight. So first of all, oops, I guess I am new here. I am not a historian. This is my favorite slide, like this. So I get anxious. I got a little anxious when I was invited to present with the Baltimore City Historical Society, because I'm not a historian. And I realized that if I could see some of you on the screen, like you would be like, yes, you are, or it's what I mean here is I'm not a trained historian. I'm trained in rhetoric and in gender, women's, and sexuality studies. And I've always been interested in history, but I'm not, I don't have formal training in it. And I do think that getting over that fear of not being a real historian, it has been a project for me personally. But also there's something from having a different point of view that I think can bring out different kinds of history. So I'm going to tell you sort of how I got interested in it. So it's a bit about me. This is me with my bicycle. So here's my origin story. I went to graduate school for 7.5 years and at UC Berkeley. And I learned to write like an academic and to think like an academic. And I can still do that work if I need to, but it's not my favorite at this point. And I really felt like I lost my voice, my writing voice and my sort of perspective. Sorry. Okay. So then I got a postdoctoral fellowship in at Tulane University, and I moved to New Orleans. And I remember driving across the country with my partner at the time and being so excited about something new until I woke up in the morning in Paris, Texas in August and went to put my luggage in the trunk of the car, and all of these giant crickets sprang out, and I was like, oh, where am I? What's happening? And then driving into New Orleans during a heat wave in August, it was it was like an entirely different universe for me. I'd never seen a place like this. Like I hadn't been there before, just until I drove up to move there. And I cried for the first 10 days because it was so hot and I was sweaty all the time. Um, and then I got used to being sweaty. And I was like, this is what happens here. And you just have to dig into it. But then what happened is that this postdoc wasn't a real job. I didn't know how long I'd get paid. My relationship ended. I was heartbroken and didn't really know what to do with myself. And somebody gave me a bike. Actually, it was Stephanie Bordy gave me a bicycle. And I started to ride my bike around. And to ride a bike in New Orleans means that you have to pay attention to the asphalt like 80% of the time because it is so, like, if you think Baltimore's roads are bad, like visit New Orleans. It is just an entirely different universe. So I realized that one way to get out of my funk was to go on a bike ride and pay attention to something that wasn't me, right? You had to pay attention to the road. I have an identical twin sister. She started a blog called What I Ate for Lunch and Why. And so in order to mock her, I started a blog called What I Saw Riding My Bike Around Today. And I started to write almost every day on this blog, and I started about 14 years ago. I wrote on it today. It had been months since I wrote on it, but I was and preparing this presentation. I thought about how much that bicycle had really shaped how I think about and do history. So I got this job at UMBC. It's 9 months till it starts. I'm living in New Orleans. I have a bicycle and a blog, and I visited a national park and really enjoyed myself. And I got one of those stamp books. And I remember a friend took a video of me getting my first national parks passport stamp. And I looked at the camera and I said, I think I could get really into this. And I did. I got really into it. I watched Ken Burns' National Parks movie, and then I watched all the Ken Burns films. I watched the Civil War one like 3 times. I have so much to say about it, but I won't say it here. But this kind of approach to thinking about public history that Ken Burns was giving me and the National Park System was giving me, and then being out on my bike and thinking about history really helped me understand um, how it made me curious and made me want to ask questions about how places come to look like they do. Because if you ride your bike in New Orleans, you can go 3 miles and see like 17 different kinds of neighborhoods with different, houses in different states of repair or disrepair. It's a lot like Baltimore. When I moved to Baltimore, I was like, oh, this is a lot like New Orleans, but the roads are better. So that daily practice of riding my bicycle and looking at what I'm passing, right? Why is it when I'm on my bike in Baltimore and I ride, I live in the Charles Village neighborhood and I ride across Greenmount to go to, say, Lake Montebello or Herring Run Park, it's like I'm entering a different universe, right? If you're familiar with the neighborhood, the Roland Park is, the Guilford neighborhood is right here, and Waverly is right here, and never the twain shall meet, right? When you're riding a bike, you're paying attention to infrastructure, and you notice that you can't make a turn into the Guilford neighborhood between 33rd and 39th. So on a bike, I'm wondering, why is that, right? What can I learn about that? So that's me on a bicycle and becoming a kind of junior historian with my bike blog. So I want to talk about some of the phrases in this. So this is, for me, history is very much about the doing of it. It is, so the other sort of strand in my historical perspective comes from my work in gender and sexuality studies and ideas of uh, Michel Foucault, and these ideas that any kind of history we do is a history of the present. And what I've always understood that to mean is that the kinds of questions we ask tell us something about who we are now, right? So if I ask a question like, what, what happened on this block that was related to queer history, I have to care about queer history, know something about that block, right? I'm likely, not always, but likely queer. A lot of, we can talk about that, why people tend to study their own group rather than others. But anyway, so we can have the kind of fixed history that we have, say, this is a picture of me giving a tour for Baltimore Heritage, the Civil Rights Walking Tour in Upton, which if you haven't done that tour, you really need to do it. It is a 1 mile radius that changed the world. It's just fantastic. And when I do that tour, I also think about, why doesn't this neighborhood look anymore like a neighborhood that could change the world? I mean, obviously it can, but it's got a different look to it. Anyway, so this is a sign at Henry Highland Garnett Park, and it's got a lot of text on it. And I'm guessing that very few of us, if we have walked by this park, have stopped and read the whole sign. I mean, I did, because I'll read anything. But why is this sign here? Why does this park look like this? But if I cross the street, it looks completely different, right? In order to, I think, do history, it's not enough to tell just that story, but to also tell that longer strand of history, like what has changed and why. Um, Henry Highland Garnett, just if you don't know about him, is super radical, militant abolitionist. Frederick Douglass was like, whoa, whoa, man, you're way too radical here. He was, after John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, he said that if you didn't stand up and support that violent raid, that he was just done with you. He was really passionate about that. He also, for a while, argued that free African Americans should leave the United States and go to Mexico or Liberia, or just leave the United States. And when I tell that story, I always think about like another guy who was saying that free African Americans should be sent away. It's different to go versus being sent, was Francis Scott Key, who was one of the founders of the society that wanted to remove African Americans from Baltimore. Anyway, I could go on, and now I wish we were on a walking tour, because I really love like doing it together, right? So in the tours, which I'll talk more about in a minute, the tours are a great place to have a conversation. Like, why don't we know about Henry Highland Garnett, but we do know about other figures? And why do we know about Harriet Tubman in certain ways? When I first learned about Harriet Tubman, I mean, I don't remember when, but I took a class in graduate school, and with Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a political geographer, and she put a picture of Harriet Tubman on the screen in a seminar, and she said, that's not a broom she's holding. And in that moment, I was like, anyway, I could go on and on, obviously. So the part where I am a trained like subject matter expert is this idea of queer. And I think about queer in two different ways, and both are relevant when we're talking about doing queer histories. So I think about queer as many of my students think about it, the way that I might use it. I might say, hey, I'm Kate Drabinski. I told you I was a lesbian, but I might tell you I'm queer. It depends on my mood. So queer has become a kind of umbrella identity category for anybody who is non-normative in ways around gender and sexuality. These terms are always up for debate and change. And so some, you know, queer is, for a lot of people, queer is just an epithet and it's negative. And for, it's something that's been hurled at us as a way to be, something negative. For others, it's kind of reclaiming, like, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. So that is the way I think about, that is an important way to think about queer and queer histories, because for me, queer histories is the story of people who fall under that big umbrella, right? The histories of people who are not normative in terms of gender and sexuality. Queer history is about the lesbian organizing that happened on Able Avenue, right? It's about the Baltimore Gay Alliance starting in 1975, the year of my birth, and like how it happened. It's about queer people, but queer is also, in queer theory terms, queer is anti-identitarian. It comes from um, a, a sort of philosophical and literary theory background, and the argument is that if I tell you I'm a lesbian, for example, what is it that I'm telling you, right? That I drive a Subaru? I don't. That I love cats? I do. That I love dogs? I mean, a student brought a dog to my office today and it was amazing. But that I drink a lot of tea, that I'm white, that I don't believe that trans women are women, right? I don't want to communicate some of those things. I'm happy to communicate, like the cat lady thing, but a lot of that stuff I don't want to. So this pressure of an identity category to bring in a new kind of norm is something that queer theory wanted to and still wants to resist. Like, how do we think about identity as not fixed, right? As something that changes, right? If I think about my own identity in terms of gender and sexuality, it's changed a lot over the years. If you know me in real life, you know that I will not be caught dead in a pair of pants, right? That's because I started wearing a skirt when I moved to New Orleans because it was so hot and I wanted more airflow. And when I got on a bicycle, the skirt felt like a kite. And so just in an embodied way, I really loved it. But for the world outside, it was a real gender shift from me wearing, my giant khakis and big flannel shirts. So yeah, so queer theory is about the kind of slipperiness of identity. And if I say I'm going to tell a lesbian, gay, history, like a lesbian and gay history class or something, am I only going to tell the stories of people who identify as lesbian and gay? Because there are a lot of people who don't use those terms and don't understand their identities in those ways, whose histories I'm interested in and curious about, who live in non-normative ways. So queer as an identity category can fix the subject of our historical inquiry in a way that is that's going to miss a bunch. So this is the insight of queer theory that I think is really helpful. And then there's history. All right, so as you heard, I was one of the co-editors of Baltimore Revisited, and we wanted to put out this book. Nicole King and I and Josh came on to the project a bit later, but we both taught and love and still teach the Baltimore book. And we were like, but we need new stuff. So we have a zillion authors in this book, and it is to me a kind of, I started with my insecurities about not being a historian. One of the things that, like, putting out this book, I was like, oh, this is like an imprimatur. Like, now I sort of count as a historian. And I do have a piece in this, but it's an interview with a lesbian, and we're just talking about being lesbians together. But what this book the process of writing this book helped, like, reminded me is that there's no end to the stories we can tell and the histories that we need to share and uncover. It's just there, it is so rich and there is so much to do. If you haven't picked up Baltimore Revisited, man, the bang for your buck on this thing is incredible. I mean, there's so many amazing articles in here and it barely touches the surface. But it's a reminder that there are so many layers of history, so many stories to tell. And then for me, the most interesting part is doing this queer history in public. Which public, where, and why? Why is the publicness important? And and I'm going to sort of start by going through some of the projects that I've worked on and some ways that we've approached these questions. And so I'll sort of give some examples of what this public is and why it's so important. I'm going to start with some pictures of Mount Vernon, which you might know as the Gayborhood. I was talking with some folks. There's going to be an event at the Walters at the end of the month, and we were talking about what somebody said, oh, everybody knows that Everybody knows that Mount Vernon is the gayborhood. And I'm a gay person. Look, I was lesbian, gay, and queer, all those, and like we're only 20 minutes in. That's amazing. Anyway, um, it's for me, I've always sort of thought of it as where the men go. When I first moved to Baltimore, that was sort of what I thought. And now a lot of the places that were here aren't there anymore, right? So this is a picture of, some of you may recognize, this used to be the Hippo. Now it's a CVS. And the hippo that used to be on top of that ball on the top of the building is in the archives at University of Baltimore. Uh, if you don't know that history, this is just a CVS, right? It's a CVS, and I might be interested in like, what's that thing on top, but it's just a CVS. I do want to point out that CVS is good at taking over old queer and feminist spaces. The CVS at 25th and Charles, which is now shut down, used to house a feminist, socialist, a lot of lesbians, when you put those two words together, press that published Rita Mae Brown for the first time, for example. That press, obviously no longer there, but it was a CVS until a couple of years ago. So way to go, CVS. This is a picture of, oh, wait, I need to go backwards. Sorry. I thought there was a picture in here of this, but there's not. Across the like catty corner from this picture is where, okay, somebody put in the chat, what was that gay bar called? I'm just forgetting. It was called, I forgot it yesterday too, but it was a gay bar. Somebody put in the chat, and I bet somebody did. Grand Central. Thank you, Ray. So thank you, Emily. I feel less alone. Just forget. So Grand Central was there. And if you go by there now, there's a little front that looks like it might have been Grand Central, but now it's these big condos. And next to it was a place called Sappho's. It was, I think, part of Grand Central, but it was like the women's part. I remember going on a date with a woman there when I first moved here. I was like, oh, well, go to Sappho's. And then it was just the two of us, and the pool tables weren't operational. And I was like, well, you can't have a lesbian bar without pool tables. Anyway, but we have these stories of our time in these places, right? And if we, so I want to show you another one here. This is a parking lot. I pass it all the time it's on Cathedral and Brexton. And it is, if you're just passing it, you might think it's just parking lot. But for me, like when I went by it yesterday, I was riding around taking pictures for another project, and I went down this alley and I was like, oh man, this is lesbian lot. Now, if you aren't a lesbian who was here when we were doing, before Pride moved all around, this is where like my queer history of Baltimore is, right? This is where I, got real nervous about, my ex was there and the new person I was dating, and like, what if they met each other too soon, right? If you're queer, you know these stories, right? Of that kind of anxiety and excitement. And so when I see this space, I'm like, we're not going to put a monument to the lesbian lot there, maybe, but maybe we should, right? So when we're talking about queer histories, they're often these kind of very ephemeral things, right? Like our moments at lesbian lot. One of the dangers of queer history, though, is, you'll hear these things about how, oh, all the gay bars are closed, like all the, things are gone. In the same neighborhood, I just want to put this picture, and the drinkery is still there. There, there's still queer life happening here. And sometimes I think there's this idea that it's all vanished because everybody's either fine and we don't need our special spaces, or we're all at kind of, different kinds of queer spaces, but we still have a lot of queer spaces that I think it's important to remember. So in this, in thinking about how would we memorialize these moments of our queer history, I worked with a couple of artists, and if you haven't worked with artists on a history project, highly recommend it. Olivia Robinson and Rachel Shannon, and they're just fantastic people who no longer live in Baltimore, but Rachel will be here next month. And we got together and we were thinking, how do we make a monument for the kind of ephemeral, the kind of ephemeral memories of queerness, right? Like, what are the things that we mark? Do we mark, it makes sense to mark like, okay, here's where the first blood was shed in the Civil War, or here's where the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 happened. It makes sense to mark those locations, but when queer life is kind of was when it was in public, it had to be kind of secretive. Like, how do we memorialize it? And, for me, like thinking about, and we started this project when lots of debates were happening around Confederate monuments, right? And there's a way that those kind of big monuments fix a moment in time. Like, we are going to remember the hell out of Robert E. Lee, right? And not right after the Civil War, but later when we're trying to continue to consolidate white power and also reunite the North and South, while writing African Americans out of the story, right? So those big monuments mark a time and place that is yeah, you remember the fights to sort of break those down. So we're thinking, what if we made a mobile monument? Because our minds can change about what we want to memorialize. And we want to have a way to memorialize those tiny histories, right? That first date, that first kiss, that you know, those, and the ugly moments too, like, where the cop, you know, arrested me or made me feel terrible, made me feel small. And so we decided we would have a popcorn cart, and I don't remember, I think it was Rachel's idea first, because lesbians are really good at popcorn. If you don't know this, I'm glad you're at this talk so you can learn. Um, we like to have toppings like Bragg spray and nutritional yeast, and the Baltimore version of the popcorn cart definitely has uh, Old Bay, that popular demand. And so what we did is we gathered historical factoids from about queer life in Baltimore, from looking through the Baltimore Gay paper and also working with the members of the Baltimore Heritage LGBTQ Historical Society. And then we printed those facts on the back of popcorn bags, which you can see on top of the cart in the picture. And we made this amazing paper mache skirt with little openings for different toppings, and then a spot where you could share your own story if you wanted to. And then we made those flags we screen printed things from issues of the Baltimore Gay paper. The whole archive of that paper is at the University of Baltimore Archive, and it is fascinating, right? I mean, it goes from like 1969 to now. It's just wild. One of my favorite things that's come out of just staring at those newspapers, they used to do fundraisers that were boat rides around Baltimore's Inner Harbor, and you would get haircuts. It was like boat ride and a barber, and then people would drink and get haircuts. Anyway, that's kind of fun to know that. Anyway, so we took this popcorn cart a number of places. We combined it with a light installation in Waverly. One of the things I love about Baltimore is we asked the city council member if we could plug it in the light pole. And she said yes, and made that happen for us. And we just shared popcorn with whoever passed by, and talked about, what's your story from living in this neighborhood. We took it to queer prom. That was really fun. I think that learning these histories, and I teach these histories at UMBC, is super important, especially for queer youth, to know that you're not the first one, right? To know that you have ancestors, to know that you're not acting like this because of TikTok or, things that, or peer pressure or something, to know that there's a long history. So we'll bring our popcorn and we'll have fun. And so this project was an attempt because we could change the popcorn bags anytime, right? We can, now this cart lives in Austin with Rachel Shannon, and she's printed new bags she brought to New York, to tell different histories. So it's a monument, but it's one we can move around and that can tell a whole lot of different stories. The other, so this is me with two of my fellow tour guides for the LGBTQ Baltimore Heritage Committee. And that's Lewis and Richard and me, and we are all wearing, Lewis is wearing his MCC Baltimore Pride church t-shirt, and um, uh, Richard is wearing a t-shirt from, another Baltimore Pride from like 1997 or something. And I've got my Able Community t-shirt. We're a bunch of cheerful tour guides. And when we started doing the popcorn cart, we realized how little written queer history there is in Baltimore. There's very, very little. There's a lot about DC. Um, there's some lesbian history in histories of socialist feminist organizing and feminist presses, socialist feminist presses, but and there's a book of photographs that's available, but there's not a lot of written history. And so we went to a meeting with these lovely folks, and they have lived this history. So Lewis and Richard and Shirley, who no longer tours with us because of her knee, but they were there. And so they had a lot of stories to share, and we learned a ton from them. I decided to stay on the committee because I felt like they needed a young mascot, with quick knees. But more than that, it was that I realized very quickly that if you don't have a woman there, LGBTQ history becomes G history. You need to, as they say, if you're not on the table, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. You need to be at the table to make sure other stories are told. So I realized that if I wasn't there, Shirley was on her own. So I stayed in the group, and I've learned so much from doing these tours. But these are public tours, and Richard, Lewis, Shirley, and I are all really different people. And we had a lot of fights about what kinds of histories to tell. And so this sort of goes back to my discussion of the public in public history. One of the biggest arguments that we had was about the Stop on the Mount Vernon tour, where we talk about where Divine ate dog shit on Tyson Street in that John Waters movie. And one of our tour guides was like, that's disgusting. Nobody wants to know about that. And I'm over here thinking, that's all anybody wants to know about, right? But for some of our tour guides, it was like, there's something kind of dirty about this. And this isn't a history that we should necessarily be highlighting. A similar issue comes up in our Charles Village Waverly tour, where Wyman Park Dell was for a very, very long time a prime cruising spot for gay men. And we know this because of police blotters and from organizing that we read about in the gay paper. Is that a story that we tell? I think it absolutely is. I think the ways and the places we express desire, that's a really important part of our history. But for others, it's like, we don't want to, talk about these lurid affairs, right? So it depends on your audience, but it also depends on your tour guides and what stories they want to tell. A final thing that has come up for me in doing these tours is just a reminder of how much primary research we need to do, because there's also a danger of telling only the stories that these 3 or 4 tour guides know, and tell them over and over and over again. And there are stories of people who were deeply involved in organizing in Baltimore. But a lot of people aren't, who were queer, fall under that umbrella, were not deeply involved in organizing or weren't reading the gay paper, right? Like, I'm sure there are queer people on this call who, who don't have never been to the Pride Center in Baltimore. Like, we're not all doing that work, but our stories are still really important. And there's a danger, I think, in just telling the same stories over and over and over again. And it's sort of that danger of a single story issue. So I really love doing tours with these guys. I've learned so much from them. Richard is like a font. If you get to do a tour with him, definitely do it. He knows everything. And there's some there's the kind of ephemeral, like, let's tell our stories part of the popcorn cart project. But this project tells histories in a kind of more concrete way that I also think is super duper important. So facts like in the Mount Vernon tour, we talk about Gertrude Stein, who lived in Mount Vernon. She moved to Mount Vernon and moved to Baltimore in 1897. And, we'll show you the house she lived in. And Baltimore is where she said that she learned to box, smoke cigars, and fall in love with women. And if that is like the best advertisement for Baltimore I've ever heard. Um, the first gay pride parade in Baltimore was held on Park Avenue between Monument and Chase Street. It was just 3 blocks long, and it was in 1984. And then it moved up to the Waverly neighborhood and was on 31st Street, in front of what is now Normals, but was the 31st Street Bookshop, which was a locus for so much feminist, um, queer organizing then, and in many ways still is, right? It's a vibrant organizing neighborhood. Um, the Baltimore Gay Alliance was the first organized grassroots LGBT political advocacy group, and it formed in 1975, and they had a tiny little office at 416 East 31st Street. Like, so to see that place and to know what kind of organizing was happening, I think is really that kind of like concrete history is really important. In 1978, the Baltimore Gay Alliance and the split, and that became the advocacy arm of organizing. And there was also a gay community center, which was a center for services, right? So for me, knowing that is really interesting, to think about like how organizing happens now, and how do we understand both like political resistance and organizing along with mutual aid and the kind of services that we need to survive. So those histories are really important, and we're able to tell those on the walking tour. The danger is just if those are the only stories that we tell. Another thing I love about doing walking tours is that the people you're walking with always have something to share that you don't know. And so that's been really rewarding too, like to hear other people's stories, or people like vehemently disagreeing, right? So like the woman I interviewed for the Baltimore Revisited book, the article I have in that book, she talked about Able Avenue as Lavender Lane, and she said that on what she liked to do on Sunday mornings was sit on the porch and watch women jump from house to house because they had slept somewhere else the night before. And when I told this story, you know, Shirley was like, that never happened, right? And that's the thing about like when you get stories, is that people can completely disagree. I have an identical twin sister. We spent less than 5 hours apart growing up, and we still have, I think she ate the last zinger, and she thinks I did. If you don't know what a zinger is, I feel sad for your childhood. All right, so the walking tours have been really interesting, and they're a great way to sort of bring it alive, and to remember that the streets that we're on, other people have been here living different kinds of lives, right? So if we were to do a history of the corner of Greenmount and 31st, we would have so many different stories to tell, right? So which stories do we pick out? And that really got me interested in an oral history project. This is a picture of some of our students I work with, and Donna Martin, who lives at Charlestown Senior Living. And Donna reached out to me because she wanted, they had an argument at Charlestown that they had a pride event at Charlestown, and there was a lot of backlash from certain members of the community. And so she was like, could you come in and just talk to the people who live, and this is a senior living facility out in Catonsville. Could you come and just like talk a little bit about like LGBTQ stuff? And so we maybe can have a dialogue going. And that has been incredibly fun. And I realized very quickly that one of the ways we can use history is also to increase, I mean, duh, right? But to increase understanding. And so I've started bringing students there. This is Sage, August, and Marcus, and we went and just shared our coming out stories, ours, theirs, mine, and Donna's, in a kind of intergenerational dialogue. And from that talk, I was like, I want to know more about Donna's story, because her coming out story is so different from mine or from my students. And so I, got some oral history training, and we interviewed Donna, and we were sort of growing the project basically to build the archive of stories that I wish that we had, so that we don't just have the stories of the person who was the president of the Pride Center, but we also have the story of, of Marcus and what it's been like for him to come out as a young person. So the project is ongoing, but it's sort of still in its infancy. But what excites me about this is that it gives us a way to get at histories, while of course understanding that nobody's story is like true, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't learn from it. So we're trying to build a sort of a big archive that can complicate our understanding of the queer past, and also is something that we can activate to do public programming to help us understand. So this summer, students will be working with the oral histories to make podcast episodes that will be on the Baltimore Heritage website, so that we can start to, increase the kinds of stories that we tell in public about queer life. So that is my sort of a quick run through of the kind of things that I think are really important with doing queer history in public. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if anyone has a question, or more importantly, a comment or something to share, that would be fantastic.
Incredible. Thank you so much. Yes, so just encourage anybody to either put your question in the chat, or if you would like to unmute yourself, you're welcome to do so, and either share a story or have a question.
I have a question, Dr. Kate. It's Top Shelf.
Hi, Top Shelf.
So I was wondering, I'm like finishing a bite of ice cream. There is some photographs from a gay man's house in the Waverly neighborhood. He passed away, and they've come into my possession, and it's a beautiful assortment. And some of the photos seem to have been taken inside a club that was maybe at the corner of Greenmount and is that 31st, like where normal, or maybe more like where
Where
Red
Emma
now?
is.
Yeah. Because they have the address and the name of that club on an envelope with the logo. Can you remind me the name of this gay club? Do you remember?
Was it the Torch or the Porthole?
Oh my God, it's great names.
Those are the ones that I know used to be there. I know, aren't those great club names?
Yeah. So I'm wondering, do you have advice on where to like bring these beautiful mementos of like our shared queer history so that they can kind of live on?
So I'm not an archivist, but there are archivists on this call. Lindsay, you're an archivist. Are you still here? What, do you have any advice? Okay, maybe Lindsay's not listening, but I think that finding an archive, right? So like the UMBC special collections, that's where we're storing our oral histories. And we did last year, our project was to interview members of the Charm City Kitty Club, and that's an ongoing project. And Lucky Baltimore gave us a treasure trove of like past flyers from events, and just going back to the very beginning. And if you don't know Charm City Kitty Club, watch out for the next show because it'll be great. But it's Top Shelf, how would you describe it?
A fabulous cabaret where you can see all the different kinds of arts happening at once and meet your next ex-wife.
Yes, you exactly. And so we got that material, and that's going to go. Hey, Lindsay, thank you. And Lindsay, and the people in special collections are going to preserve that as part of our project. So it might be at University of Baltimore, it might be at UMBC, but finding a place, I think, to keep it would be really great. And
cool, thank you.
Thank you.
I definitely have my questions, so I wanted to give some space. So let's see if we have anything.
I see.
So Ashley in the chat Have you or has your good work actually ever been challenged by a disciplinary historian, someone trained to be a historian?
Yeah, so some of my best friends are historians. My department is the bathroom that that my gender is supposed to use is on the fifth floor, which is where the historians are, and I'm on the fourth floor. So I hang out with the historians all the time. My sister's partner's a historian. I love the historian. Josh is my neighbor's a historian. Um, it I wrote a dissertation about, and I'm sure you all know this because you've all read my dissertation on uh, the ascetic practices of monks in late antique Syria. No? Okay. And I had one historian on my dissertation committee, and my dissertation, it was about that, but it was mostly about how the stories we tell about ourselves make ourselves into new beings. So like and that problem of how if you want to say, um, transcend the body and transcend sexuality, like these early Christians are trying to do, you have to think about the body all the time. It's wild, right? You have to you're always controlling it. So it was mostly about self-making as practice. And I had one historian, and she sent back my dissertation, and she said, this would never pass as a dissertation in history with these footnotes, but I guess it works for you. And I was like, well, thank you, because I just want to get out of here. I was totally done with grad school. But it did sort of put in me this thing like, um, and this is something that Berkeley did. Now well, I'm always getting personal. So I'm continuing to get personal. It really sort of trains you that there's one way to do things. And I think that's incredible. That it was incredibly damaging to me. When I met Ken Burns, and I got all kinds of critiques of Ken Burns, don't get me wrong. But his documentaries restarted my sense of curiosity that had just been beaten out of me by grad school. That was like, if you don't have the right footnotes, you don't count. In this day and age, like, no, because I don't present myself as a historian. I give, like every summer, I give a walking tour of Pratt Street, and we talk about the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which is like my favorite. We talk about the Pratt Street riots. We talk about the use of Pratt Street as a place where human beings were bought and sold. We talk about the light rail and why does it open the same day as Camden Yards open, and what does that tell us about who transit is for, and why is the Hilton owned by the city, and we talk about all that stuff, and then we go to a ball game. And no historian has ever checked my notes to see if I'm telling the right stories. And I think I have finally, at almost 50, gotten over being right. Like I'm not concerned that Leslie thinks that the the women were hanging out looking for who was house hopping on Sunday mornings, or Shirley's like, no way, that never happened. Like, that's true. Both of those stories are true, and so I sort of let myself be less bothered. All right, Keisha asks, like New Orleans, Baltimore is hyper racially segregated, right? Baltimore is like the most segregated place, racially segregated place I've ever lived. I've lived in Oakland, I've lived in Brooklyn, I've lived in Hartford, I've lived in Portland, Oregon, which you might not think of as being hyper segregated, but they kept their racial segregation laws on the books until the 70s. I mean, it's just bananas. But Baltimore blows them all out of the water. Lesbians could go to the very popular bar for women, Coconuts, just on hip hop night in the 1990s, and anytime it buns downtown. How's the racial divide covered in the archives and captured with oral history? That's such a really good and important question. And in terms of the archives, this is something that worries me, right? If our only archive is the Baltimore Gay paper, and we're only looking at then we're looking at stuff that was written by people who were active organizers for other people who were active organizers. So in that, there's a lot about racial segregation in bars. There was a group called White and Black Men Together that did a lot of organizing in the 80s. They sued the Torch and the Porthole for their racially discriminatory practices, right? But we would lose like how like radically different life is for, say, a white lesbian, a black lesbian, and not just in like what are access to resources and life chances, but also where do we hang out. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to do the oral history project, so that we could get other kinds of stories other than the ones that are written in the newspaper. And it takes a lot of, and there are a lot of oral history projects going on. So Joey Plaster is doing an amazing one at Hopkins with students, and then also with ballroom scenes. So I think it's sort of a matter of making sure that the interview subjects are diverse, and we're not just interviewing people that Dr. Kate knows, right? Because then we're going to end up with, people who are like me. They may not be my racial identity, but they're probably going to be similar to me in class, right? So we have to sort of we have to be really mindful of that to build those stories. And that's not easy to do, right? There are different layers of trust. There are different ways that the academy has its certain ways that it does stuff that, I'm thinking, for example, I was doing a project with some students on the East Baltimore documentary photography projects, oral histories. And we had a speaker, Nia Redmond, who lives in East Baltimore. And if I were just to send her an email, and if Nia would hear, she would agree with me. If I were to send her an email and say, sign this form so you can get paid, like use DocuSign or something, like she's gonna be like, what are you talking about? Like, in order to get that to work, right, meant that I brought the form over to her house and we hung out for 3 hours and chit chatted, and it was great. But the academy often doesn't work like that. So it's a problem, I think, of sometimes of these projects coming from the academy that assumes everybody is like on their email all the time and like doing. And so for me, it's that racial segregation and also class differences that we have to attend to. And with the popcorn part project, one of our fantasies, and this didn't work out at all, but one of our fantasies was that people would come to our events, because we're just standing on the corner of, Green Mountain 30th, right? Just like standing there, 31st, across from the Waverly Town Hall, which is now artist condos, different kind of segregated housing. And and so to like standing there and handing out popcorn, we're having different kinds of conversations. But I think this is a perennial issue and question, and it's yeah. So I don't have an answer to it, except that we need a lot of different people doing oral history projects and telling stories. And like, not everybody wants to tell their story to like, my students. So that's an ongoing problem. And there are a lot of oral historians on this call who I am sure have much more experience with this question, but it is one that we keep in mind in my class all the time. We also when we talk with students about doing interviews, we talk about power differentials in terms of age, in terms of like, are we in the same community? Like, I'm going to tell you different things if I think we share things in common. I have a group of students who are African American, and they're like, we will not interview white people. I'm like, great, that's great. But the kinds of conversations that you can have, they just really vary. So but it is one of the things that I think is makes the oral history project exciting for me, because you can talk to lots and lots of different kinds of people about their different experiences. Whereas with some of the archival work, you're looking at just the records of who was arrested or the records of who wrote in this paper. And that, I think, is a much more limited story.
If it's all right, I wanted to hop in, and I mean, first just a comment, and thank you so much. This was incredible. You kind of blew my mind by dropping Able Avenue a couple of times, where that's actually where I lived when I was born, and lived there for about the first 5 years of my life, and in and around Normal's bookstore. So just I was completely unaware of that history in particular. But my question, and it kind of builds on that. Black studies and queer overlap and intersection. I'm wondering if if Lucy Diggs Slow has come up in your research or anyone else's. She was actually she was a very early educator, one of the founders of the AKA sorority, and the reason I ask is because I actually saw it on social media, which obviously is not research in any proper form, but it was a
No,
lead.
it's not, but it is. Yeah.
it was a lead that I was hoping to pursue. So I just will throw that out there for you or anybody else, but definitely an interesting figure in her own right.
I have not. Anybody on this call want to share?
I've dug into her a little bit, so David, we can catch up on her. Mostly what I know is that she ended up, it was one of these stories from history where it's like she lived with her best friend until the day they died,
Mhm.
So it's one of those. As far as I can tell, I'll share what I have with you.
Thanks,
Awesome.
Ben.
Yeah, that lived with their best friend until the day she died. Thing is like it's so hard in the um because like I don't want to assume that I don't want to take contemporary categories and put them on the past, right? Like um the example I use in class is always like Abraham Lincoln was gay, and the evidence is that he wrote these love letters to this man. But if you look at the way that people wrote letters in that time, they were all read like love letters now, right? Like think about people 100 years from now, they're going to be like, they communicated in hieroglyphs with eggplants and peaches, and we don't know what it meant, but something, right? And so I don't want to do that. And there's a way that is like in LGBT studies, uh, women are just always like completely asexual. Like we're just like, I had students ask me once at Tulane if women had sex by rubbing their forearms together. I have no idea why they asked that. But like that kind of idea that sex can't happen if there's only women involved. And I don't want to assume, but also she lived with her till the day she died. Yeah. Um, and there's when we do the Mount Vernon tour, we talk about women's education and the circle who met, and with Mary Garrett and her friends, and they hung out all the time, and then they had like a split, and it's clear that there was a love triangle, but that's like covered over. And we didn't start doing queer history in real ways until so recently. Like it wasn't until like the 80s that ancient Greek texts would in translated to English would translate the words that were sexual, because there was a fear that schoolboys would read that and bad things would happen. So we're still, I think, in some early stages of some of the queer history, and definitely in Baltimore. There's just so much to do. So I want everybody to do it.
Well, we're right about at time. This has been fascinating, and really appreciate the opportunity to learn this evening. So thank you everybody for joining us. Um, Dr. Kate, do you want them to be able to contact you, or
Oh, sure.
are
I'll put
people?
my,
Does everybody
yeah,
here know you already anyway?
a lot of people on here know me, and I wish you were all in the same room, because there are people from many different parts of my life. Susan, you saw your picture of Donna right there, right? Susan was at Charlestown too, and Emily, I see you in the bike lane. I mean, it's just really nice to see so many people here. But that's my email address, and I would love to, if you're working on a similar project or doing any queer history, it would be great to connect. So thank you all so much.
Wonderful. And just to round out our history evening, we appreciate everybody's time, and hope you'll visit us at our website for more information about our upcoming programs and resources. Next month, we'll be hearing from Dr. David Fakunle, Searching for Precious Stones, and exploration of Baltimore's arts, culture, and health efforts. So really looking forward to that. And we will have as well in June the incredible Dr. Joyce J. Scott. So again, I'll drop the link in the chat. We'll have registration information for those available soon. But until then, thanks again for joining us.
Bye, everybody.